Today we're going to be taking a look at one of the most iconic watches to come out in the last 15 years. This is a watch that comes from a historic watchmaker. It's got a great build quality, a really incredible genius design, and thanks to a famous movie tie-in, it's also got star power. But perhaps the best thing about it is that it doesn't come from a brand that's going to charge you tens of thousands of dollars for this watch. Instead, you can pick it up for under $1,000. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Hamilton Pilot Day Date, also known as the Hamilton Interstellar. Hey guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave, I live in Japan, and I love to collect affordable watches. And I've been running this watch channel here for a little bit over 5 years now, and earlier this year, the channel hit 100,000 subscribers, which was just a huge milestone for me, something I never expected this channel to reach. And to celebrate, I wanted to pick up a watch, so I decided to pick up a watch that had been kind of a grail of mine. This is a watch that I had been looking at from even before I started this channel. When I first started getting into watches, I think I probably saw it on the Urban Gentry, if I remember correctly, his review of it, and that was the Hamilton Interstellar, or the Hamilton Khaki Aviation Day Date. And I just fell in love with that watch when I saw it. And one of the things that I love about this watch is it's not trying to be anything else. Hamilton is one of those brands that has been making watches for over 100 years. In fact, they've been specifically making aviation watches since 1918, so over 100 years of history in the aviation watch industry. So there's a lot of heritage there. And the design of this watch, I think, is purely Hamilton, and it is a absolutely gorgeous design that really resonates with me. I think one of the best watch designs I've seen, again, in the last 15 years on any watch in any price range. This is a watch that I think can really hold its own in terms of design and heritage against watches from Rolex and all of these big expensive brands. Now, I'm not saying it's as good as a Rolex or as good as a luxury watch, but this is one of those watches that I don't think you have to really compare it to those and say, well, I'm settling for something less by getting this watch. I think this watch has enough going for it that on its own, it justifies its place in a lot of people's collections. Now, this video is partially sponsored by Joma Shop. They gave me a discount when I purchased this watch, when I reached out to them, telling them that I was interested in it. But even if they hadn't given me the discount, I probably still would have bought it from Joma Shop anyways. If you look at the retail price of this watch, it's just over $1,000, but Joma Shop has it for under $700. At that price, you're not going to get the manufacturer's warranty from Hamilton. However, Joma Shop does warranty their watches themselves, so if you have any problems with it, you can send it back to them to get service. And if you're interested in picking up this watch, I'll leave a link to Joma Shop down below in the description of this video. So with that said, let's start taking a look at this Hamilton Khaki Aviation Day Date Pilot. As near as I can tell, the first version of this watch was launched back in 2010, so it has about 13 years of history behind it. And I think during that time, it has really proven itself to be one of the truly iconic watches in the last 15 years. It's perhaps most famous for being the watch that Matthew McConaughey's character wore in the film Interstellar, and it played a very prominent role in that film. It gets a lot of screen time, and that definitely adds to the appeal of this watch. It's really fun to have a watch on your wrist that you can point to someone and say, hey, this is the watch that was featured in Interstellar, especially now with Christopher Nolan continuing to make some pretty epic films. But there's so much more to this watch than just that tie-in. Even before the film Interstellar came out, Hamilton had worked on this design, and they had just done, I think, an incredible, masterful job on it. Detailed specs are up on the screen, but the important ones to note, this is a 42mm case with a 48mm lug-to-lug, and it wears perfect on my 7.5-inch wrist. Now, my wrist is a little bit on the large side, however, I think that this watch would wear great on anybody who has an average to large size wrist. This watch features a Swiss-made automatic movement, the key feature being the 80-hour power reserve, which is about double of what you would typically get from a standard movement. This is great because it means you can set the watch down for a day or two or even up to 3 days, pick it up after a long weekend, and it'll still be running without needing you to reset the time. Like so many movements, this movement is based on the ETA 2824 with some modifications to get that 80-hour power reserve, the most noticeable being that it has a reduced beat rate. This one comes in at what's become a very standard 21,600 VPH or 6 ticks per second. According to Hamilton, this watch does feature AR coding, and it does look like it's doing something. It's not particularly amazing, but it is a lot better than the AR coding or lack of AR coding that was on the Hamilton Khaki King that I last reviewed from Hamilton. And as a bonus, this features an exhibition caseback, and the movement is pretty pleasant to look at with a nice custom rotor from Hamilton. It's also great to see a full 100 meters of water resistance on this watch. Now, you're not getting a screw down crown, but they still do maintain a pretty high water resistance even with that push-pull crown. And finally, I really like the bracelet that came on this watch. I think it's really high quality, really well finished. We're going to talk about that more later on in the review and also take a look at some different strap options for those of you who might be interested in changing it out to something different. Now, this watch is based on an older design, but Hamilton has done a lot to update it. Let's start by talking about the design philosophy behind this watch and what Hamilton has done here. The dial design in particular is based off of one of the most legendary and influential of all pilots' watches, and that's going back to the Type B-Flieger. And this watch from Escapement Time is a very faithful recreation of those original Type B-Fliegers from World War II. These were tool watches through and through. In fact, you could probably classify these more accurately as pieces of aviation instrumentation rather than timepieces. These were watches that German World War II pilots would strap to their wrists when they took off, and then they would turn them back in with the rest of their equipment when they landed. And so the dial design had only one thing in mind, and that was to enable the reading of the time as quickly and accurately as possible. There were two primary dial layouts, the Type A and the Type B. The Type B was the more complicated of the two. And the unique thing about it is that it featured both hour markers and minute markers arranged in a way that made it very easy to tell the time very quickly. Arabic numerals in 5-minute increments went around the outer edge of the dial, while 12-hour markers, also printed in Arabic numerals, went around an inner track around the center of the dial. And the length of the hour and minute hands was precisely arranged so that they would point to the right tracks on the dial, which means that the long minute hand would point straight to that minute track that has the 5-minute printings in Arabic numerals, making it very fast to see the minutes, while that short stubby hour hand would stop at that inner track, pointing to the 12-hour markers. And I love this design. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you get used to reading it, it becomes a very fast, very easy to read layout. But it does have a very functional, very utilitarian look to it, a design that's not really a beautiful design so much as just it works really well. And that was the whole point of these watches. But Hamilton isn't constrained to the needs of German World War II military pilots in designing their watch. And they've done what is, in my opinion, a masterful job of taking that extremely utilitarian design from the 1940s and updating it into something that is beautiful, legible, and just is infused with so much personality. Hamilton's design retains so many of the hallmarks of that Type B-Flieger. And while it does lose a little bit in legibility, it's still very easy to read, while paying loving respect to one of the most important designs in aviation watch history. So now that we have some context and the history that Hamilton has drawn on to produce this design, let's start looking at these specific things that Hamilton has done here. Starting with the handset, which is one of my favorite parts of this watch. Now, as mentioned before, Type B-Flieger watches would feature a very short, stubby hour hand that would point to that inner track going around the middle of the dial, which is functional but looks kind of awkward. So in what I think is kind of a stroke of genius, Hamilton has gone with a skeletized design to the hour and minute hand. The tip of the hour hand extends past that hour track, allowing it to have proportions that are more in line with modern watches. However, the tip of the hour hand is cut out so that it has a little triangle that actually borders the hours on that inner track as it glides around the dial. And this is just such a cool, beautiful, and brilliant idea. It's such a treat at each hour to see the hour markers being framed by the tip of that hour hand. And the minute hand also features skeletonization, except in this case, it's hollow all the way up to the point of that inner circle around the dial where the hours are. It looks great and just shows that there was a lot of thought put into the design of every little aspect of this watch. Another thing that I absolutely love about the dial on this watch is the large metallic applied minute markers. It's pretty rare to see applied Arabic minute markers like this, and I think Hamilton has really done something special with the design of these. They really have a 3D effect. You can see them sitting on the dial, which I think really elevates what would otherwise be a pretty flat dial if it was all printed. But what's particularly interesting about these markers is the finish that Hamilton has put on them. If you look really closely, it looks like there's a series of grooves that have been kind of cut into them. Not only does this give the metal an interesting finish, but it also allows it to catch the light in very unique ways. At some angles, these markers will almost completely disappear, but when they catch the light right, they glow in almost a blinding fashion. And this is a really unique way to increase the low light legibility of a watch. As long as there's even a slight amount of light, even the glare from a computer monitor, if you angle the watch to reflect that light on the markers, they're going to become incredibly visible. And in some ways, it's even more useful than the kind of lackluster lume that this watch features, which is disappointing, and we'll get into that when we get to the cons section later on in this video. Now, one thing to note about this design is that it's a very busy design. There's a lot going on here, not only because it features both hours and minutes on the dial, but also because it has a day-date complication. At 12 o'clock, the day of the week is displayed, and at 6 o'clock, the day of the month is shown. Both the day and the date do cut out portions of the dial that would normally be displaying information to help you read the time. The day of the week at 12 o'clock removes the 55 and 05 minute markers, and the date at 12 o'clock removes the 6 o'clock hour marker. And normally this would be a trade-off to legibility and design balance. It makes for a more interesting looking watch dial, but it can also look a little bit awkward with things missing. And speaking of things that are missing, those really cool metallic minute markers don't have any lume at all applied to them, nor is that central hour track loomed in any way. So you might initially think that this watch is going to be kind of hard to read in the dark. But Hamilton has implemented a lot of redundancy into the design of this watch. The lume problem is solved with a very substantial minute track going around the chapter ring of the dial, and this is what Hamilton decided to lume. It features bigger markers at the hours and then individual minute markers, which actually gives a very clean and legible lume profile in the dark. Likewise, you don't really miss the absent metallic markers at 55 and 05 because you have that substantial chapter ring around the outside of the dial, and because you have that very detailed hour track in the center of the dial. So while there's a lot going on this dial, everything is really well thought out, and it winds up still being really easy to read once you get the hang of it. And aesthetically, I think all of this works together perfectly. It's a very beautiful watch dial. I love the way certain elements appear and disappear depending on the lighting. And while normally on Type B-Fliegers, that hour track around the middle is kind of an awkward looking thing, here that thin circle with ticks for the hours and minute remind me of a solar motif. And the finely printed 12-hour Arabics are right there when you need them. And while I think the dial is a masterpiece of design and definitely the star of the show here, I think Hamilton did an excellent job on the other elements of the watch as well. The choice of adding crown guards really breaks tradition with the Type B-Flieger design, but I think it gives the watch a unique look. And the overall case profile just really exudes this vintage Americana feel. The finishing is also quite good, with very high polish and wide bevels going along the tops of the lugs and the sides of the case, with fine brushing accentuating the case's curves. And the bracelet also feels very sturdy, very well built, and I think it just perfectly matches the character of the watch. This doesn't look like a bracelet that was from another watch that was just kind of brought lazily over. This bracelet looks like it was made for this watch. The rectangular links give off a masculine feel, and the primarily brushed finish also matches the head of the watch, while the polishing on the edges of the inner links just makes things a little bit more interesting. The clasp is also very well manufactured and looks great, but it would have been nice to get a couple more micro adjusts. This one only features 3 micro adjust holes, which is kind of the minimum amount you would need to hope to get a decent fit, but the weight of the bracelet balances the head of the watch pretty nicely, giving it a very nice feel on the wrist. Now, this watch does feature 20mm lug openings, which means that there's going to be a ton of straps available for this, and Hamilton does give you the option of purchasing this on a leather strap, and I think that's a great option. I think it looks really good on this Horween leather strap from Nomad Watchworks. Kind of softens the look a bit and maybe gives it a more of a vintage look than on that metal bracelet. Another strap that I was really interested in trying out on this watch was a sailcloth strap, and Artem recently sent over one of their new green colored loopless sailcloth straps, which is a really exceptional strap. And I think that kind of drab green color really lends the watch kind of a military look that fits with that aviation theme. And because this is an aviation watch, I also want to try it out on a NATO strap. I also have a NATO that Artem sent over, so I tried it on that one, and I think it also looks good on this kind of black NATO strap as well. Now, one thing that is really noticeable when you start putting it on straps is that 20mm lug width. That's a narrower lug width than you would typically find on a 42mm watch. I think the bracelet is so well integrated in the design of the watch, you don't really notice it, but when you do start putting over straps, it does kind of look maybe a little bit out of place. The narrower band kind of accentuates the 42mm width of that watch, possibly making it wear a little bit larger. And I think for that reason, overall, my preference is going to be keeping it on the bracelet. But I will probably throw it on a strap from time to time because I really like changing the look of watches up like that. A couple of other things I want to mention real quick if you're interested in purchasing this watch. The dial does have a very slight sunburst finish that I think is really cool. In most lightings, it looks pretty much like a flat black, but every once in a while you see that sunburst pattern come out. And the lume portions have a very crisp white look in daylight. I'm not sure exactly which lume formulations Hamilton has done here, but I suspect it's Super Luminova C1. So C1 is not as bright as C3, but C3 has kind of a greenish, beigeish tinge in the daylight, and then a very bright green glow in the dark. C1 has a much whiter, crisper look in the daylight, but not nearly as bright after dark. And that's one of the biggest problems that I have with this watch is the lume performance. There's a couple other things, but so let's go ahead and jump in and talk about some of the cons and the things that I didn't like about this watch. The biggest disappointment for me on this watch is the lume. And this is a common complaint on a lot of Hamilton's watches, but I think it's fairly obvious here that they just really cut some corners when it came to the application of lume on this watch. I would have much preferred to see a strong application of blue glowing BGW9 instead of the kind of weak green glow that's on this watch. This kind of lume looks like the sort of thing you would find on a much cheaper watch than this. When I ran it through my 1-hour J-score test, it came out with a very weak score of 2, meaning that it's basically invisible before the hour is up. Within about 30 minutes, the hour-minute markers had completely disappeared, and before the hour was up, the hour-minute hand had also faded out as well. This watch retails for over $1,000, but it was destroyed by a $200 Seiko 5. The other big complaint that I have about this watch is that there is a noticeable amount of dust under the crystal of this watch. And this is something you just really shouldn't see in a watch in this price range. It wasn't until after I had done the macro shots that I really realized how much dust there was under here, but ever since then I've noticed little specks of it even with the naked eye, and that's been a pretty big disappointment. The last thing that sort of struck me as subpar on the quality side of things is the cutout of that skeletonized minute hand. There appears to be some very slight warping on those thin cutouts that I find slightly distracting at certain angles. So the design and overall build quality of the watch feels like a 10 out of 10 for me, but the quality control and that lackluster lume really kind of lets the rest of the watch down. Given how much I am drawn to everything else about this watch, I'll probably overlook those problems. But for the price this watch is going for, I really feel like I shouldn't have to deal with these things. All right, if you guys like this video, please hit the like button down below. And if you're interested in affordable watches and haven't subscribed to my channel already, please hit the subscribe button and do so. Also, if you're interested in getting a watch themed t-shirt like this one, I sell them on my website at justthewatch.com. This is a slightly updated design. I've had this one out for a while. Head on over to the website and check it out. Also, let me know what you think of this watch from Hamilton. For me, I really think this is a modern classic, and I've been overall very happy with it in the time I've had with it so far. But I want to hear your experience as well, and if you're interested in this watch, or if there's other kind of modern classics like this that you think are worthy of that kind of affordable grail title. Let me know in a comment down below, but that will wrap it up for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you later. Bye.